All right, I'm going to introduce our next panel. And I think we can all agree in MedTech that managing patient data and access to that data is a hot topic. We all have to figure out how to properly manage and protect the data while still enabling us to somehow use that for the betterment of patients and to move us forward from a MedTech perspective. So the next panel is being moderated by Jill Gordon from Nixon Peabody. We're delighted to have her here to help us move this along because of her experience as well in this, in addition to her panel of experts. So I'm going to ask them to start coming down as they're mic'd.
Okay, we'll introduce ourselves while they're getting mic'd. Perfect. So Mike M-I-K-E couldn't make it today. So we've got some additional people. We'll just introduce ourselves for the panel. I'm Jill Gordon. I'm a healthcare attorney. I work in Los Angeles. I primarily work with healthcare providers and digital health companies, anything from large academic medical systems to kind of small startup providers and others that play in that space. Some consumer products, and we'll talk about that portray themselves in the health and wellness space. And I do mostly compliance and transactional work.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Desert Horse-Grant. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Innovation for UCLA Health and the Co-Executive Director of UCLA Biodesign. I share a wall with Mike Pfeffer, but I'm not sure that qualifies me for being here. But he is in an emergent meeting that we're having at the health system. But I also am on our data governance committee for the health system. And I'm going to speak a bit about that and some of the work that we're doing in the digital space for the health system in partnership with industry.
Great. Clara Lajonchere. I'm the Deputy Director for the UCLA Institute for Precision Health, and I'm on faculty in the Department of Neurology. I've worn many different hats across my career. Primarily, my sort of comfort zone happens to be in academic medicine. I was on faculty at USC prior to here at UCLA. But I've also done a lot of work on scientific advocacy at the federal level and worked in when I was working, I was a VP for a nonprofit. I did spend 2.5 years in the Silicon Valley prior to being recruited to UCLA, and I was working in the digital healthcare space, company that started with direct-to-consumer and then moved into, now is going down the FDA approval path. As part of my role here at UCLA, we do a lot with, we think about machine learning, especially with precision health, genomic medicine. So I've been involved with a lot of folks as we think about data, privacy, and not just what to do with it, but the role that the patient plays in stewarding his or her own data.
Good afternoon. Jennifer McCaney, Co-Executive Director of UCLA Biodesign. I'm also in the faculty in the medical school and the business school. My specific areas around healthcare technology, disruption of technology through digital delivery and other mechanisms. And in particular, here at UCLA, we are championing digital innovation sort of across the healthcare spectrum, both as therapeutic, platform, and device.
Thanks. So we just wanted to give a little bit of perspective. This talk is trends in digital health and patient data. And when we were preparing for this talk, I thought it was really interesting to kind of think about the arc of what we call digital health and where it started. I would say maybe 15 or 20 years ago, a lot of the projects I was working on was really focused on kind of teleradiology products, where we were really using telehealth purely as a mode of communication, and there was not much other than supplanting phones, fax, and other modalities of communication with some kind of computer-type support, right? And using real-time, either visual or images on a computer as a way to communicate. I think that where we are now, if we look at what we call digital health and the use of technology from purely as a means of communication, there's so much more going on in both the health and wellness space with all kinds of personal devices and how you use information, as well as just how we're thinking about the gathering of data and the amalgamation of that, and then data as a product in and of itself, and manipulation of data as a product in and of itself. And we were just talking about looking at some of the trends going on in the market, especially with earlier stage companies in healthcare. And what was striking to me is a lot of our clients that are pushing out with direct-to-consumer products, particularly gathering information either in-home lab kits or apps that are gathering a lot of information around tracking systems, whether they are in the femtech space, period trackers or things of that nature, that the question whether their marketing and whether their business plan is really the product itself, or if it's gathering a large amount of data on a population set to later do something different with the data in and of itself. And I just thought the others in the panel might have some thoughts around that.
Yeah, we have an interesting project going on right now around mental health. UCLA Health took up 2 grand challenges, and one is in depression and eliminating depression by 50% by 2050. And something that was really interesting that came up, because they want to do a play on both of what you just said, really it's around collecting the data, but also allowing the consumer to be able to utilize the information we're coming up with. Because we've deployed a team working on this project, and because we're the health system, we're able to implement, and we are doing this now across all 180 clinics when a patient's walking in, even if you're there for primary care, that we can really be able to do a mental health check at the same time that they're able to collect that data. And so I love that within our ecosystem, we're able to figure out the problem, come up with the idea, figure out the trial, and implement it into the health system. And I think mental health has been at least one example. There are many, but it's a transformative space where digital is really coming into play and figuring out immediately when someone's doing their mental health check, do they need to be seen by a professional, or is it more going to be a consult, or is it going to be just bringing them to a place where they can do it themselves online and really get a check that way. But we've definitely had some incidents where we feel this is really important, and also suicide prevention and really the monitoring of a patient when they're hospitalized, so that when they're going into the bathroom, you understand what's happening in that private space, and that we really feel like a digital aspect can provide a healthy experience for a patient that's battling something when they're in our health system, not just in the Resnick psychiatric hospital, but in our regular inpatient hospital. It's been an issue of having people attempt suicide. So we really think digital will have a transformative space in mental health.
And here's it's interesting because on the health system side, we probably go a little overboard in terms of security, privacy. If you're an academic medical center and you've had a data breach, you're going to swing all the way to the other side where everyone and everything is on lockdown. And we've certainly experienced that, and we even on the research side have experienced the after effects of that, where even accessing data is hard. I will tell you, however, my experience in working for a startup was very different, where obviously we were using iPads, we're using mobile phones, mobile technology. It was targeted towards autism. It was specifically using machine learning to identify kids most at risk for neurodevelopmental disorders. So how benign is that? But as we were sort of looking at our roadmap and developing more technology, whether it was getting kids to read a story on an iPad, what I was hearing from our data science folks was, but we're gathering all of their eye movements. We're gathering all of this other data. And of course we're gathering data that we're asking patients, but what about that some of the more passive data that we're gathering, especially on children? So that was way outside my comfort zone, but having worked with many other startups in this space now, I realize that becomes part of the norm. And so as a parent, I want to know exactly how you're going to be using my kids' data. Is it going to be sold? And so what are the issues, what are the safeguards that we can put in place? A lot of folks don't want those safeguards because it prevents them from, racing down that roadmap of theirs. And, in some cases, they become, as Jill just said, they end up, their business model changes because all of a sudden they've aggregated all this data, and then their business model is basically, I have a ton of data, and now that's a commodity. So I've been having some trouble wrestling with both sides of that. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have.
Yeah, I think Jill and Clara, you bring up excellent points. Are digital health companies data companies? And will, under other industries, how have they gone through those growing pains, whether it's finance or others? And when it comes down to it, patient privacy and patient data security are two fundamental issues that I think are tied to that. And the biggest example that we can all think of is obviously the announcement of Project Nightingale, right? And so we're looking at
today. There
right?
was, yeah.
Maybe there's unfolding news that you can share. But when we look at, from my more of an academic perspective, when we look at patient data, and we sort of have the data that's generated within the realm of a health system, but then we have the data that's user-generated, so real-world data that's generated by a patient. And somehow, when that data makes it back into a health system, that becomes HIPAA-protected data. Mm-hmm. And so the path along which the data is following, from whether it's user-generated data and then into a health system, or what are those controls, because right now those controls don't exist for that particular pathway. And that was a lot of discussion about what's going to happen even with the Fitbit data that's being acquired by Google, right? And so with that Fitbit data, you go back into a health system and bring that to your physician, does that become PHI, right? Personal health information. And how will we as regulators, HIPAA has sort of always developed sort of a more adaptive role, right? As we've progressed and technology has progressed faster than HIPAA has progressed. And so those business entities, right? Google is a business entity as defined by HIPAA. It's bound to certain restrictions and regulations around how it handles data. But at the same time, we need to address PHI in the realm of traveling to and from the health system when it's generated, like the startups that you're talking about, Clara.
Yeah, I think that from a legal standpoint, it's really interesting to see that the laws actually cover certain types of data depending on who actually holds it and how they're holding themselves out, right? Under HIPAA, are you a covered entity versus are you an unregulated business, and your responsibility towards data is really just based on the Federal Trade Commission guidelines, which say, have you disclosed to your users or who you're collecting from what the potential use might be of that data, and have they agreed, which tends to be a click-through agreement on an app. And so I know counseling a lot of clients that have early stage businesses that have a clinical aspect to it or health and wellness aspect. We spend a lot of time talking about, especially when funds are tight in the earlier stages of the company, do you have enough money to actually be compliant with HIPAA, and is that going to be something that you can do? And if not, and are you getting bang for buck actually being a covered entity and putting out a clinical product? Can we pull back on your product and really not make claims that it's diagnosing or treating, and instead do something akin to like 23andMe? I think is a really good example of they got in trouble by making too many claims about the validity of their product and what it could actually do in terms of a diagnosis. And so what happens is they pull back, and if you actually look at their website of what the results, the test results are that they're providing, they don't tell you that they're providing clinical information for sure. It's something more akin to a horoscope. And so I think that we're seeing a lot of products out there that intentionally are not crossing the line into clinical products, so they're not regulated, and then they have a lot of freedom in order to use and commercialize all the data that they're collecting.
And there's a fine line between sort of that direct-to-consumer versus therapeutic space. And so a lot of people want to stay very close, like to the middle, but on one side of the line. Mm-hmm. It's expensive if you're developing a product that you want a digital product. It could be a robot, it could be an app, and you want it for therapeutic purposes. My advice to some of the startups that I work with is you have to be very clear about what the intended use is, because it can break you out of the gate, which is why a lot of folks start with direct to consumer, more on the educational side, and then when they start gathering data and doing the clinical studies that are required to be able to move to the other side of that line, they have to really be mindful and thoughtful about, the mantra in the startup world is, if you're going to fail, fail fast, right? It's that sort of agile, if this doesn't work, you're not going to beat a dead horse. You need to move to the next thing. And so, but you also have to be careful if you're a company and you're really trying to develop something in the therapeutic space. If you don't get it absolutely right, or you're not coming in with a lot of data, then you could really shoot yourself in the foot. Because if you're going to go down that FDA path, it takes a long time, and oftentimes the evidence that you have to provide is costly. And so, but on the flip side of that, we then have some digital healthcare products that are really subpar. And so how do you balance that?
I think that's right. And when you talk about kind of what's being put out there, and it's not just what consumers think that they're getting, which they may not be getting, but I think a lot of companies that haven't worked in healthcare don't actually understand the quality of the data sets that they're using, or how hard it is to get data, or the quality of even the raw data that are coming from healthcare providers, and the level of noise that's in them, and when they're feeding them into algorithms, how wrong things can get. It's interesting, I was at a conference recently, and a data company was presenting and just talking about one piece of having to clean up data, which you don't think about, which is that when they were pulling information from patient charts, that the diagnosis and treatment codes weren't necessarily what the patients actually, what their true diagnosis was, or what their true treatment was. It was that, not that the records were falsified, but the doctors were using certain codes for insurance purposes, so it was covered service.
And it was designed for insurance purposes.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah, the codifying.
The one thing that's interesting is that when I was the chief science officer for the startup in the Bay Area, one of the things that I love my data scientists, right? We can't live without them. And they come in with really eager, and some of them, their approach is, I want to do machine learning, let the computer tell me, like just basically have at the data, and what they say is the source of truth. And, so now, my role was to look at this and say, well, that might be all well and good, but this is meaningless information, right? And then when you start delving a little deeper into the data, you start realizing that there's all sorts of noise in there. So if you don't know what you're starting out with, that could not be a good thing. And so from the precision health perspective, we're looking across 4 million patients, multiple encounters. And so we've been working on lab data, just one little piece of data. And we are working with some of our physician informaticists who really understand, they're physicians, so they understand it, and then they have a lot of informatics experience. And we've been at this, we have this great resource. My computer scientists are playing with the data, they're coming up, they have some question marks, things that don't compute. And finally, when my physician informaticist gets in there, it's like, Clara, do you realize that when we are integrating lab data from all of our many laboratories that provide testing for us, in some cases we're expecting a numerical field, and but what's coming in is in text form. And so the field is actually a -99. But if you don't know that, and you're not picking that up in the data, then how you're interpreting data is going to be completely skewed and completely off. Now, theoretically, you're going to do data cleaning and such things, but there's so much we don't understand about the data, whether it's, not using diagnostic codes and focusing more, if you're looking at diabetes, focusing more on the hemoglobin A1C and looking at medications that a patient might be taking, and kind of reverse engineering a diagnosis based on the patient symptomatology. So there are lots of different ways to approach it, but having a basic understanding of how noisy or how dirty something is, and appreciating the multiple perspectives that have to be at the table at the same time, I think is something that not everyone quite gets.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true, and even when you get that, expand that even more, because I think a lot of folks say, well, the more data you have, the cleaner it is because you've got larger volumes to work with, so it cleans out some of that noise. But in talking to data scientists, especially when you're starting to pull data from internationally, that clinicians may not have the same way of describing certain things. And so the nomenclature is for describing something isn't synced up, and so you've got larger data sets, but they actually incorporate more noise because there isn't a baseline understanding of how you're characterizing something. And I think it just makes it really difficult to sort through and understand the quality of what you're looking at.
So at UCLA Health, we have 50 quality officers. So we have people who spend their time thinking about these problems and trying to, as you said, sometimes it's an impression. There is no exact answer. So there's lots of work to be done in this space. I think just earlier I wanted to say, since I'm on our data governance, something you had said earlier, just to give the academic point of view, when we are taking requests from industry, and we've certainly said no to many of them. Sometimes painfully, it's like painful to say no, but it's so complicated to try to figure out how to protect our patients and then still play with everyone. And I just wanted to let you know that one of our major areas of a reason we say no is that it has to have societal benefit. Right. So we're kind of not interested in that horoscopy space at all right now in our partnership. I call it between like horoscope and science. So we have to have societal benefit for at least for right now what we're doing. We do believe, I think like many, that one day all data will be out there. But for now, while it's not, there are many of us who take it very seriously. And we actually bring in from Anderson, we have ethicists who come in and help us think through. I mean, it's actually very difficult to make these decisions when you know you have the data. But we also know some of the problems with the data. And we do, for the projects that we do deploy teams that make that data really clean, but that is very costly. Yeah. And so as I get requests, which happen all the time for people to say, like, why can't we use the data? It's because it's not just like using the data. It's really a team around it that makes it, to make it really clean.
And I want to pick up on something you said that's really important, because I am pro academic industry collaborations. I think that there's so much value that industry brings to the table. I think the primary reason that they don't collaborate more is because academic medical centers, in this case, they make it hard, and it just is what it is, but also it's the pace at which people go, right? On the industry side, they have a lot of resources, and they can move really fast. And there's a lot of frustration when you come and you want to work with an academic institution, and all of a sudden you're like going at a glacial pace. And I mean, having been on this side now, UCLA Health really does try to move things along. Never going to be at the pace of industry, but you know, how can we create win-wins? And Desert was saying we look at societal impact. You know, for us, there's always a quid pro quo. I mean, I hate using that word.
Not that word. I was like, let's strip that word out. Try again. Thesaurus.
But you know, so what I was gonna say after I said the word was that, you know, there's always we would rather look at it as what's the value proposition. And our leadership has said, you know, as long as it makes sense, everyone thinks it's more financial. But really, it's what's the value proposition for our patients? Because, for example, our data are incredibly valuable. They are a commodity, and we need to treat them as such. And, you know, our patients, and I'm sure this is coming down the pike, we can argue who's the steward of the data, but let's just put ourselves in the perspective that we are stewards, custodians of this data while it resides within our custody. But, you know, we want to make sure what's the level at which the patient will benefit. Is it more on the preclinical side where it's an incredible scientific discovery, or is it going to be on, we are returning, in the case of precision health and genomic medicine, we're returning a result to a patient that can in the short term change the course of a person's life. And so I've worked in many different academic environments, and UCLA Health really, they're thinking about it that way, not just how much money can we make. Trust me, money's always on everyone's minds. But the conversations I've been involved with really have focused on, and this is the leadership of the hospital systems and the School of Medicine together, what really is the impact that we're going to have on the patient.
And I know Mike Pfeffer's answer to this, and he's said it, we believe patients, it's their data.
Yeah.
So it's their data and we're giving it back to them. And so we were one of like the first 8 institutions with Apple that we put the entire medical record back to them on their iPhone. So just so you know, I mean, I know that it's very clear how we feel about it. But when you aggregate the data, that's the part where we have to protect it.
Right.
But to any individual patient, you can have all of your data.
Yeah, and I think sort of speaking to building on the kind of trade-offs between volume and veracity, right? So that data science cleaning aspect is sort of how I like to frame that. And then when we talk about custodian of the data, right? So as health systems, we own the data, right? That is how it's described. But at what point does a patient owning their data become valuable? And I think that's the trade-off. And so if when we eventually will move towards patient ownership of their health data, whether it's personal or protected, at what point does it have societal benefit when it's just one record? And that's really the piece when digital companies become data companies, and really to scale a digital company, a data company, you need a volume of data. And so I think at some point digital health will hit that road bump when if there are single companies with individual troves of data, they don't have the scale. Or the individual patient in the rare disease group doesn't have the scale on their own without the assistance of a patient like me, or an ability to find their cohort, or another health system that's going to focus on precision medicine, such as the Institute for Precision Health where Clara sits. And so as a society, we have to sort of think about those trade-offs. And patient ownership, I think most of us in this room will probably agree that as patients, we should own our data, but how can we extract societal benefit?
I think that I'm kind of curious if people in the audience have thoughts, and I think we were trying to hope maybe we could have some discussion around this, but I think we're in an interesting time because in the United States, we think about data as really an asset that can be commercialized, and at least historically, we have relied on the law as the ultimate determinant of what's right or wrong and how you're treating data. And I think we've gotten to a point where clearly HIPAA is not reaching enough coverage for folks who think that data should be much more private and that people should own their data and there shouldn't be as much trading. I think on the other hand, consumers are not totally aware and thinking about how much data they're giving companies and what's being used with that data. And I think it'd be shocking to most people to sit down and think about how much information they've given about themselves to companies that have pretty much free use. And consumers have agreed to that effectively. And we're now trying to rethink with some of what's happening with the Ascension Google deal and some other things of maybe there's a different standard that's not quite the law where we have to be better stewards. And there's a ton of pressure from, I think, academic institutions and health systems, which in some ways feel more pressure because of reputational issues. But they, at the same time, they need to partner and they want to innovate with both big and small companies that are really looking at the commercial aspect of this, of how those two meet together. And we've seen law in California change, but it hasn't really caught fire across the rest of the country, and I'm not sure that the law is ever going to be as fast as how people would like to think about this.
One thing you just said that in the California change, I'd like to know what was the change in the California, but the other thing is that we have this data from the remote patient monitoring, and if we don't use the electronic medical record as a reference for using of integrating what we learn from the outside data to get the patient outcome to improve. If we want to move that needle, there should be some collaboration, so we should show to the academic world or the university like UCLA that we are moving the needle
I think you're talking about decision support tools. Is that, so how can this information actually be used by physicians for patient care?
Yes, if we are taking care of all the remote patient monitoring data and we are analyzing it and we want to bring it back to the health system.
Yeah.
So I have a good collaboration example. He wanted to talk about the law in California. Do you want to address that? Or do you want me?
So California recently enacted consumer protections around and privacy, higher standards of privacy law, which are actually higher than HIPAA. So HIPAA's a floor.
Yeah, that part I know.
Right. So it's just that, right?
Helped it not make it harder.
Well, what's good, one of the things that happened that I
depending
love,
what side of the fence you're on.
yeah,
right?
you no longer have to like accept to use. Like now you can qualify. You might still want to use something, but not give up all your data. So I loved when that passed in California. I had an example of collaboration, but not in decision support. If there was something.
No, one of the things that we're trying to that we're trying to do here and create infrastructure for is what you were saying, which is folks are doing remote monitoring, whether it's with the Fitbits or the Apple Watches or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's more than that. You have whether it's beacons in the home that are monitoring, movement and things like that. And how can we use that? So we're able to use that in the cardiovascular space where people wear these Holter monitors and the data are remotely being evaluated by a team, whether that's active or passively. It's really hard to know, and that's why I mentioned decision support tools, because the challenge is, and I think you mentioned this, how do you know what data is meaningful? You get a barrage of data, you get a steady stream of data from multiple data sources. How can you make sense of that? If we take a step back, our goal is to become more of a learning healthcare system, where as we start, as we generate data, we're analyzing it, and then those data are going back in some way in the form of decision support so that a physician can use that in real time to help to change the course of care management, perhaps, right? So how do we get there? That's how, again, understanding what data are meaningful. That's where our computer scientists and engineers are looking at data, analyzing the data to try to understand where's the signal in all the noise, and then thinking about, okay, just because this data might be meaningful to the engineers because it's really cool, right? And so we're using it to generate knowledge. At some point, once we cross that line, we have to make sure that it's important and valuable to the provider and then ultimately to the patient. So we have to serve it up in a way. For me to give you data on an entire whole exome, your whole genome or your whole exome is not going to make any sense. But for me to say, if we look at this particular set of genes that are actionable, meaning that there's something that you can do, let's just take BRCA and breast cancer, for example. BRCA genes also increase risk for prostate cancer, as an example, not just breast cancer. But let's just say, if I were able to serve up that information and in more than a year's time that goes by, because you're doing the research, then that can change the course of management very quickly. You had your hand up over there in the back.
Yeah, I want to calibrate what you said. You made it all sound like it's all about medicine. And we all in this room, yourself included, know that most of these problems are lifestyle related.
Absolutely.
Health. So I would propose that you don't say the doctor, because the doctor doesn't understand much of the lifestyle. That has to do with diet and 10,000 other factors. I mean, you're dealing with, for instance, neurodegenerative. Most of the burden is not of the doctor, which is 10 minutes next patient, please. With the caregivers who need to understand things the doctors don't understand and don't care to know for all sorts of good reasons. I'm going to propose that this is a much bigger problem than doctors getting medical data and providing medical advice. If we look at the problem that way, we're looking at maybe 1/10 of the problem.
No, I agree.
1/10 of the solution.
I agree. Social determinants of health are actually, so when you think about genetics, and I'll just talk about it from where I sit, genetics contributes maybe 30-35% to disease, and all of the rest is what we call environmental or lifestyle factors. And so what we've been trying to do is figure out how to collect those data because they're not being collected in any kind of uniform way. So you're absolutely right. It's only a small part of the larger ecosystem. I think when but yet we have to make sense of all of the data coming in from all of the various sources to think about this in a more holistic way.
So I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the data field is so vast. I've had the privilege of co-founding a couple of initiatives and companies in the field. One, a computational biology company out of Dana-Farber, and more recently a computational pathology company out of Memorial Sloan Kettering. And we're not trying, when we launch those initiatives, we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're being very targeted in what we're trying to, the questions that we're asking and answers that we're seeking around the data and the metadata that's emerging from that. So that being said, I've launched a couple of companies out of UCLA here, so I would really like to understand how you're interacting with industry and industry partners right now around clinical decision support or drug discovery, and talk about the boundaries of that interaction. I was speaking with Earl Weinstein here at UCLA about constructing a digital sandbox where people could come in, the data stays inside firewalls, but people could begin to interact with it. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, so we did create a virtual sandbox, and we have millions of patients in it. We released it back in, I don't know if it was March or May of last year, but in the spring, we released it to our internal community to be able to use because it's de-identified and you don't need IRB approval, so you can get going with it. And I think there was a lot of excitement around it, but you can do limited things with the data unless you really know R or some programming language to really play with the data, but it's begun. And that was really a push from industry. So although our first use case wasn't for industry as the first set of users, it was really because we did not have the mechanism that we could say yes to some of the proposals that were coming in.
So what was the use case in that example?
There was we didn't end up saying yes at the time because we weren't able to do it, but there was an industry partner who wanted to collaborate in pathology, and they wanted to be able to keep the data with us and to use it, but we just weren't set up for it. But it just made it that it jumped the queue of all the millions of things that we were doing, and we were like, let's get this going. And so Mike Pfeffer and his team did the work to make this here, and then we had to go through many months of rounds of the UC-wide campus and how were we going to interact with industry and what were the rules going to be. And so Dr. Mazziata, our vice chancellor over all of the health sciences, led that, and that had to get approved and did. And then we just got this committee that I'm on that now we have a 5-day turnaround for requests that come in. Depending what the type of request, we can pretty much get an answer quickly. So we had to go through a lot in this 2019, the last 6 months to get to the place where we are today.
And depending on the nature, so this was pathology, depending on what you're trying to do, if it's mostly computational and it's mostly data focused, that's one thing. But when I've been involved in discussions with some collaborations where you have large biotech companies and they want to collaborate, but it's just not feasible for them to take all of their data and move it into our cloud so that they can, because you want the data to live together. And so how do you marry that in a way that's not going to be, it's going to blow the bank in cloud costs. So we have to sort of think about what makes sense. And a lot of industry doesn't want safe harbor data because they don't, they want to be able to look at time points. That's important. What's the trajectory, the longitudinal trajectory of certain encounters.
How are you discriminating between, say, PHI versus metadata?
Metadata is okay.
So that can live either inside the firewalls or outside the firewalls.
Yeah, because the metadata, that's something that's not as, I don't know whether we've allowed it outside the firewall. So as an example, for when it comes to clinical health data, when our researchers are using it, again, and we use it in the sandbox as well, right? So when we interact with those data, when we generate data for tables with the metadata, right, we can't download it, we can't take it out. So they're working to figure out ways that we can do that because if we're going to publish a manuscript, we need the data, and we don't want to have to sit there and tabulate it, right? But again, these are baby steps, and I think we've moved the needle a lot in a short time to be able to get to where we are. But it's these use cases that get us to think about.
Industry helped us prioritize it, so
Exactly.
we can thank the pressure of our
Right.
slowness to get us to create some policy around it. I do want to say, just because I think it's interesting, and we are trying a pilot now where it's bi-directional, where we have our data, but all of you out in the world have things that move much faster, much more nimble. And so Jennifer arranged a meeting for us to go to BCG Digital Ventures. And from that initial meeting, many, many more occurred. And we decided that, we're very slow to market with any of our digital technologies. And so we are trying, and it has been approved at many levels right now, this concept of us doing certain things in-house and then having external partners do that other piece. And how do we offer each other something? We have the ability for the clinical trials and for the patients. And so for some of the apps or for some of the for-profit companies, how do they utilize our health system? And then how do we utilize the speed of people outside of academia? And so we have just launched the beginning of what hopefully will become more and more pilots. Did I just turn this off?
You did, sir.
Okay.
Clara, you mentioned some resistance coming from academia when it comes for remote patient monitoring from the standpoint beyond even HIPAA. You talk about noise and what have you. But I think when it comes to certain chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, I think there is some accuracy in this. I mean, because it is known what level the provider should alert remotely the patient of a certain condition that probably has to take care of it.
Absolutely, and those are just some examples. When I think about, for example, data from my watch, right? When you think about doing a study with a watch, whether it's even a sleep study, and you're monitoring a patient's sleep, there is such variability that you can't get any two devices to give you the same answer. I was talking more about that kind of thing. If you're in the cardiovascular space, that's very well defined, and the parameters and the technology are well defined. When you're talking more about health lifestyle, whether it's a watch or some other kind of thing, that's noisier data.
Okay, but what do you say, because I read some statistics that says about 70% of providers either don't know about this or don't want to use it. 70%. I mean, what do you say about this? When Medicare has already approved it, this is reimbursement, whatever. Can you comment?
So I've been working with different groups, medical associations, on development of clinical guidelines. And what I can tell you is a lot of time goes into developing really carefully curated clinical guidelines. And the percent adoption is about 3% in some cases among providers. And so some of that has to do, in my background in autism as an example, the guidelines say you need to screen kids with autism and that all primary care providers need to start doing it at, now it's younger, but it's 18 months and then 24 months, blah, blah, blah. And even though this has been, over the last 10 years, talked about, it's been published, it's very well defined, a recent study came out and it said maybe it was like less than 10% of providers actually said that they were doing this for all sorts of reasons. I think that it's now in the genetics space, when we ask providers how comfortable they feel about returning genetic information to their patients, a lot of them will say, I don't feel comfortable. So that says something. Because if I say, well, I'm going to do all of this work to serve up genetic information that's going to be useful for your patient, wouldn't you want to do that? And what they'll say is, have someone else do it. Because they just don't feel confident. And a lot of that has to do with education. A lot of that has to do with, as an example, I've actually heard that some physicians think that 23andMe is a clinical grade genetic test. And so, pardon me?
If two.
Yeah, and so there's such variability, right, about what is clinical grade, what is not. And so I think physicians, I think that now we have a new generation of physicians and practitioners, and it's really changing. And we see it in, we're in the midst of our medical school curriculum redesign. And so a lot of this has to do with just educating physicians. The other thing that they're hampered by is if there isn't a decision support tool that can help them that's integrated into the EHR, because the EHR is their life. And it's really for insurance and billing purposes, but it is something that they have to interact with. So if it doesn't live there, it's much harder for them, unless you're in concierge medicine or you're in a private practice, it's much harder to integrate. So I see that. It's a bit of a conundrum. It's like, what do you do when we're serving up really valid, in some cases, information and you're just not using it?
We're
That's a
almost
question,
at
2
time.
minutes left.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes. We're all here after. We can answer questions. I just thought maybe we try to recap by what you all see as kind of the future for technology and data.
You can take my time, Jennifer.
Sure. You know, I kind of, when you were speaking, Clara, it reminded me there's a paper that Eric Topol wrote probably about 4 years ago in Nature Precision Medicine, and the title was From Womb to Tomb. And it sort of reminds me of, okay, think kind of, you know, what are your frameworks, what are your guidelines as you begin to think about data and digital health, particularly patient data? And I kind of like to fall back on sort of the framework of classifying the domains of data. So how do you think about the clinical grade data? How do you think about the claims data? How do you think about the imaging data that's stored in your PACS, your DICOM, all of those types of images? And then, of course, the real world data. And I think that whether you're a startup or, you know, industry executive, you sort of have to think about where am I along that spectrum of data and which domain am I in? And then within that domain, there's specific data and security safeguards that you sort of have to follow. And then potentially that need to be made. And I'll let Jill expound on the legal and the regulatory aspects that you know potentially could happen. But here at UCLA, like Clara said, you know, there are education measures that are happening. Maybe Desiree, you want to talk to? There's the genetics counseling master's program that we're implementing here at UCLA Health as part of our learning health.
We're interviewing students today, actually, for that program.
So it is happening.
Yeah, it is happening. We're recruiting. We will have our first cohort the fall of this fall of 2020.
With a digital component, because we're trying that pilot. Yeah. So I don't want to, I think we're out of time, but definitely there were lots of hands up, and we're happy to go outside and answer any other questions. Okay.